Let me just say something that a lot of people aren't going to want to hear. The America that your parents grew up believing in, the unshakable, untouchable, runs the whole world America, that version, it's already gone. And most people haven't even noticed yet. Or maybe they've noticed, but nobody's really sitting them down and saying, what's actually happening here? And look, I get it. It's uncomfortable. Nobody wants to hear that the thing they were told was the greatest, most powerful force in human history is quietly, slowly, but very clearly losing its grip. But here's the thing. Pretending it isn't happening doesn't make it go away. It actually makes things worse. Because when you can't name what's happening to you, you can't deal with it. And right now, millions of people in this country are feeling something they can't name, and it's eating them alive. So let's actually talk about it. The economy first, because that's where most people feel it directly. Inflation is not a statistic anymore. It's something people feel every single week at the grocery store, at the gas pump, every time they look at their bank account after payday. We're talking about an inflation rate that's running around 4% and climbing. And certain things, gasoline, for example, are up 40, 50% from where they were not that long ago. Now, in a lot of countries that might sting, but people have options. They can take public transit, they can walk, they have alternatives. But here's the thing about America specifically. This country was literally built around the car. Most people live in one place, work in a completely different place, and shop somewhere else entirely. And unless you happen to live in one of the handful of big cities with decent public transit, you have no choice but to drive. So when gas prices go up, it's not like you can just opt out. You feel it immediately, painfully. And that's just one piece of it. When you zoom out and look at the full picture, wages aren't keeping up with those price increases. What economists call real wages, which basically just means what your money actually buys you after accounting for inflation, those are going down. Not slightly, noticeably. People can feel the difference. And when you ask people not just how things are right now, but how they think things are going to look 6 months, a year from now, the answers are bleak. But here's where it gets bigger. Because this isn't just about prices and paychecks. There's this staggering level of inequality that has been quietly building for decades. And it's reached a point now that we haven't seen in about 100 years. We're talking Gilded Age levels of wealth concentration. Think about this for a second. In New York City, one city, you can literally walk a few blocks in one direction and be near some of the most extreme private wealth that has ever existed in human history. And then you walk a few blocks the other way, and there are people who regularly don't have enough food in the same city, within walking distance. That's not normal. That shouldn't be normal. And the fact that we've somehow gotten used to it says something really disturbing about where we are as a society. This didn't happen overnight, by the way. Back in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, something kind of remarkable happened economically. The country actually became more equal. The New Deal, all the programs that came out of that era, genuinely compressed the gap between the wealthy and everyone else. And for a while, it worked. But then, starting around 1945, and just continuing on a slow roll all the way to right now, pretty much everything that was built in that era has been dismantled, piece by piece. And if you want a number for it, about 75% of those gains are gone. Now here's where it gets really interesting, because all of this, the economic stress, the inequality, the political bitterness, the wars, all of it, it doesn't make sense unless you understand the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is this. America is going through what every empire in history has gone through at some point, the decline. That's not a partisan talking point. That's 8 million people in a single city sending a message through the culture because the formal channels feel broken. But think about the British Empire. At its peak, Britain ran something like a quarter of the entire world. And then, over the course of about a century, that power gradually, then suddenly, wasn't there anymore. The United States has been doing something similar, just more compressed, and we're living right in the middle of it. The signs are everywhere if you know what to look for. The political hostility that feels like it's on a completely different level than just normal disagreement. The absolute furore in cities like New York. You had a situation recently where a professional sports team actually asked the President of the United States not to come to their game. Think about that. An entire team said, please don't show up. That's not a partisan talking point. That's 8 million people in a single city sending a message through the culture because the formal channels feel broken. And that level of hostility, that social fracturing, it doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from decades of economic stress, from promises that were never kept, from manufacturing jobs that disappeared and never came back, from a generation of people who did everything right and still ended up financially worse off than their parents. Which brings us to something really important, because there's a kind of scapegoating that happens when an empire declines. And people start feeling the economic pressure, but nobody's explaining to them why. When people are hurting and nobody gives them an honest account of what happened, they become incredibly vulnerable to whoever can point at something and say, that's your problem. That's why your life got worse. And what actually happened to manufacturing in this country? Companies, American companies, run by American executives, answering to American shareholders, made the decision to move their production somewhere else, where labour was cheaper and profits were higher. That's it. That's the story. It wasn't an invasion. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was a business decision made over and over again. And the people who paid the price were the workers whose jobs disappeared. But instead of explaining that, it's easier to just point at immigrants. Point at people with darker skin. Point at foreign countries. And look, I understand why it works politically. It's a lot simpler than explaining the actual mechanics of global capital and corporate decision-making. But what it does is it guarantees that nothing actually gets fixed, because you're blaming the wrong thing. And speaking of things that don't get fixed, let's talk about the wars. Because this is something that keeps coming up, and it connects directly to this whole conversation about decline. There was this whole campaign promise, right? No more endless wars. We're done with all of that. And then somehow, instead of fewer wars, there are more. And the thing about military entanglements, once you're in them, getting out is genuinely complicated. Because if you just leave, that looks like a loss. But if you stay, it costs money and lives and political capital that you increasingly don't have. Here's the uncomfortable truth that I think a lot of Americans are starting to figure out. Vietnam, the United States lost. The war ended, the US left, and the country that won is still being run by the exact same political force that was the enemy at the time. That's not spin, that's just what happened. Afghanistan, same story. The US was there for 20 years, and when it left, the country went back to looking pretty much like it did before the US arrived. Iraq, you can look at the state of the region and ask yourself honestly whether anything got better. And when you try to explain this to people, especially young people, the reaction is genuinely shocking, because they weren't taught this. In school, in the media, in popular culture, the story of America is one of winning. Of course you win. America always wins. It's just assumed. And if you suggest otherwise, it feels almost like a personal attack, like you're saying something obscene. But here's why that matters practically. If you can't accurately assess your own track record, you cannot make good decisions going forward. You'll keep doing things that don't work because you've convinced yourself they work. Now let's talk about the other side of this, the rise of China, because you can't really understand the decline of American dominance without looking at what's been happening there. Over the last 30 years, the US tried everything to limit China's rise. Covert operations, trade wars, tariffs, banning companies from doing business there, sanctions, diplomatic pressure, everything. And here's the number that sums up how well all of that worked. Over those same 30 years, the US economy grew at about 2 to 2.5% per year on average. China grew at somewhere between 5 and 9% per year, every single year, for 30 years. That's not a gap, that's a different category entirely. What China managed to do economically in roughly 40 years took Britain several centuries. It took the United States, standing on everything Britain already built, still about 2 centuries. And China did it in 40 years, without the kind of institutional help that other developing economies got, without foreign experts flooding in with advice and assistance. They just did it. And look, I'm not saying this to suggest that China is perfect, or that there aren't serious concerns about how that model works, but to pretend it isn't happening, to pretend that 30 years of trying to stop it produced any results at all, that's not a strategy, that's denial. So where does all of this leave us? The honest answer is there's no easy fix. There's no policy, no election, no single leader who can reverse what's been decades in the making. And I think deep down a lot of people sense that, even if they can't quite articulate it. There's this background anxiety that something fundamental has shifted, that the old rules don't apply anymore, that the things previous generations could count on, stable jobs, affordable housing, the sense that your kids would do better than you did, those things feel increasingly out of reach. And the danger in that situation, the real danger, is what happens when people are genuinely suffering and nobody gives them an honest story about why. Because the vacuum gets filled. Someone always steps in to fill it with something, and it's usually not the truth. Because the truth is complicated and takes more than a sentence. The truth is that we're watching a transition in global power that happens maybe once or twice in a century. The truth is that this transition is going to have real consequences for everyday people, not just governments and geopolitical strategists. The truth is that the way out of this, if there is a way out that doesn't involve catastrophe, requires the kind of clear-eyed honesty that is, almost nowhere to be found right now in mainstream politics or mainstream media. But here's the thing I actually want to leave you with, because I don't want this to just be doom and gloom. The fact that you're watching this, that you're trying to understand what's actually going on, that matters. An informed person makes better decisions, not just politically, personally, financially, in terms of where you live, what you invest in, what kind of work you pursue, how you think about the future. We have probably the most consequential economic and geopolitical transition unfolding in real time, and most people are either completely unaware of it or have been handed a story about it that serves someone else's interests. The information is out there, the honest analysis is out there, but you have to want it. And maybe the most important takeaway here is this: the outcome of what's happening right now, the tug of war between a declining power and a rising one, the economic restructuring, the political instability, the wars. You are going to live with the results of all of this, regardless of where you are in the world. Because the financial system is global, the supply chains are global, the consequences are global. So the question isn't really, is this happening? The decline is real. The numbers don't lie. The question is, what do you do with that knowledge? How do you position yourself? How do you make sense of a world that looks increasingly different from the one we were told to expect? And that starts with being willing to look at it honestly, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. All right, that's it for today. If you stuck around this long, I genuinely appreciate it. This is heavy stuff, but I think it's important. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on this. Do you think the US can course correct? Or is this just the natural arc of empires playing out? I'm genuinely curious what you think. Like and subscribe if you got something out of this. It really does help get this kind of content to more people. And I'll see you in the next one.